Welcome back to The Whisper Knows. This is the place where stories don't scream, they whisper. Tonight's question is simple, and once you hear it, you won't be able to unhear it. Lower the lights, turn the volume just a little higher, because some signals were never meant to be received. In the winter of 1997, in a town so small it barely appeared on maps, a house waited to be demolished. It had been empty for months. The power was shut off. The owner, a retired radio technician named Arthur Bell, had died alone in his living room from heart failure. No foul play, no mystery. Except every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., the neighbors heard a radio playing inside that house. Not music, voices. They weren't loud, they weren't clear, but they were unmistakably human. Calm, measured, as if engaged in conversation. No one wanted to be the first to investigate, until Daniel Reed did. Daniel worked the night shift as a security guard. He was practical, tired, and unimpressed by rumors. On his third night of hearing the reports, he parked across the street from the abandoned house. The windows were dark. The street was silent. At 2:16 a.m., the air changed. Daniel later said it felt like pressure building behind his eyes, like the moment before a storm breaks. At 2:17, the radio turned on. The sound didn't travel outward like normal audio. It felt intimate, close, as if the noise was forming inside his skull rather than entering through his ears. Instinctively, Daniel pressed record on his handheld device. The voice that came through the static was male, and it knew him. "Daniel," it said calmly, "you're late." His hands started to shake. He had not told anyone his name. The street was empty, the house was sealed, and the radio crackled again. "The signal is weak," the voice continued, "but you can still hear us. That means you're close." Daniel ran. He didn't stop until he was back in his car, heart pounding, breath shallow. The radio stopped the moment he crossed the street. The next morning, he turned the recording over to the police. They told him it was interference, a prank, stress. They always do. The tape eventually reached Dr. Eleanor Shaw, an audio archivist who specialized in obsolete broadcast systems. She had spent years restoring forgotten recordings from broken reels and broken transmitters. She knew interference. She knew artifacts. This wasn't either. The voice existed in isolation. It didn't belong to any known frequency band. It didn't bleed. It didn't echo. It was as if the sound had been inserted directly into the recording medium. And beneath it, barely audible, were other voices, whispering. When Eleanor isolated the background noise, her blood ran cold. The whispers were repeating names: Arthur Bell, Margaret Bell, Thomas Reed, Daniel's father, dead for 11 years. There was no database connecting them, no shared location, no overlap. The odds were impossible. Eleanor stopped the playback. For the first time in her career, she didn't want to hear more. But the radio didn't care what she wanted. 2 nights later, Eleanor drove to the house herself. She arrived early, just after 2 a.m. The building was exactly as described: dead, cold, silent. At 2:17, the radio turned on. This time, the voice was female, soft, familiar. "Eleanor," it said, "you finally came." Her throat tightened. She had never released her name publicly. The house had no power, no signal. "We've been calling for so long," it said. "Most people can't hear us, but you listen." The static deepened, growing heavier, thicker, as if the room itself was filling with sound. Eleanor felt memories pressing against her thoughts, images she didn't recognize, emotions that weren't hers. "Arthur built the door," the voice said, "but you're the one who can open it." At dawn, Eleanor searched the house. In the basement, she found dozens of handwritten journals. Arthur Bell had filled them obsessively, writing the same theory again and again. Death does not end the signal, it only changes the frequency. Arthur believed consciousness left an imprint, like a broadcast looping endlessly, searching for a receiver. He believed old radios, analog, imperfect, full of flaws, were capable of tuning in to that imprint. But the final journal was different. The handwriting was shaky. Once they know you can hear them, they won't stop talking. Within days, reports spread. Old radios turning on by themselves, static forming words, people waking at 2:17 a.m. to hear their names whispered from devices that hadn't worked in years. Only one pattern was consistent. The radios spoke only to those who listened, those who acknowledged the voice, those who answered back. Eleanor received an email with no sender, just an audio file. It was Daniel Reed, crying. "They won't let me sleep," he whispered. "They keep asking me to answer. They say I'm already halfway there." The recording ended in static, and then a countdown. At 2:16 a.m. the following night, Eleanor sat alone in her studio, all radios unplugged, all lights on. At 2:17, her computer speakers activated by themselves. Static filled the room. Then voices, dozens of them. One rose above the rest. Arthur Bell. "We're so close now," he said. "The door is open. You just have to answer." Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. "You are listening." And then the radio spoke again, not from the speakers, from inside her head.
Eleanor didn't sleep after that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the static return, not as sound, but as pressure, like a presence hovering just beyond thought. The voices hadn't followed her ears, they had followed her attention. She realized something then. The radios were never the source, they were only the invitation. At exactly 2:17 a.m. the next night, Eleanor heard nothing. No static, no whispers. And that terrified her more than the noise ever had. Silence meant they were waiting. She returned to Arthur Bell's journals and read them without stopping, page after page, until the sun rose again. Listening is consent. Arthur had discovered the rule too late. The dead could not force themselves through. They needed recognition, awareness, someone alive to complete the circuit. And once the circuit closed, it didn't open again. Eleanor finally understood why the voices knew her name, why they knew Daniel's, why they knew details that should have died with the people who once owned them. They weren't listening from the outside, they were remembering from the inside. The next email arrived at 2:17 a.m. sharp. No subject line, just coordinates. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Some part of her already knew where they led. An old transmission facility outside town, decommissioned decades earlier. The kind of place no one visited anymore because no one remembered it existed. The building was hollowed out by time. Rusted antennas reached towards the sky like skeletal fingers. Inside, dust coated the floor so thick it muted her footsteps. And in the center of the main room sat the radio, Arthur's radio. It was larger than she expected, modified, wires looping into places they shouldn't, components salvaged from different eras, stitched together into something that felt less like a machine and more like a wound. The moment Eleanor stepped closer, the static began. This time there was no voice at first, only breathing. Then whispers, hundreds of them. They weren't calling her name anymore. They were speaking to each other, overlapping fragments of unfinished thoughts, regrets, apologies that never reached the living. Eleanor realized the truth then. This wasn't communication. This was accumulation. Arthur hadn't opened a door. He had built a reservoir. The dead weren't crossing over. They were piling up. Eleanor, a familiar voice said gently. Daniel Reed stepped out from behind the equipment. He looked wrong, thinner, pale, like a photograph left too long in the sun. They said you'd come, he said gently. They said you'd understand. What did you do? Eleanor whispered. Daniel smiled weakly. I answered, he said. The static surged. They're not angry, he said quickly, as if responding to something she couldn't hear. They're not angry. They're just tired. They don't want to fade. They don't want to be alone anymore. Eleanor felt the weight of it then, the sheer number of voices pressing against the air, the sense of overcrowding, of desperation. Arthur's final journal entry echoed in her mind. Once they know you can hear them, they won't stop talking. Daniel stepped closer to the radio. They need someone to hold the signal, he said. Someone alive, someone anchored. Eleanor shook her head. That's not holding them, she said. That's trapping them. The whispers grew louder. Some of the voices began to scream. The radio surged with power, despite having no electricity. The antennas outside vibrated, humming with impossible frequency. We didn't mean it to hurt, Arthur's voice cut through the chaos. We just didn't want to disappear. Eleanor understood the final rule too late. The dead don't want to return. They want company. Daniel turned toward her, eyes glassy. They're already inside me, he said. But you could stabilize it. You could make it permanent. The radio began to pull, not physically, but mentally. Eleanor felt memories slipping, faces she didn't recognize, names she had never learned pushing their way into her thoughts. She realized then that the radio didn't speak to the dead. It spoke for them. And now they wanted her voice too. With shaking hands, Eleanor pulled out the recorder, the same one Daniel had used that first night. She pressed record and spoke clearly. No. The word cut through the static like a blade. The voices faltered. She spoke again, louder this time, grounding herself in the present, in breath, in certainty. You don't get to stay here. Not like this. Arthur's voice softened. Then we fade, he said. That was always the cost, Eleanor replied. She smashed the recorder against the radio's core. The sound that followed wasn't an explosion, it was a release. Static unraveled into silence. The pressure lifted. The whispers collapsed inward, like breath leaving a body for the last time. Daniel fell to the floor, alive. The antennas outside went still. At 2:18 a.m., the signal died. The facility was dismantled weeks later, the radio destroyed, the journal sealed away. Official reports called it vandalism, hallucination, mass hysteria. But some nights, in houses far from that town, old radios still crackle softly at exactly 2:17 a.m. They don't speak anymore, they listen. And sometimes, if the room is quiet enough, you can feel that pause, that waiting, because signals never truly disappear. They just lose their voice. This has been The Whisper Knows, and somewhere in the static, something remembers being heard.
Subscribe if you dare to listen.